Okay.
The U.S. Arab Radio Network is proud to offer the Ray Hanania Show with veteran journalist Ray Hanania, the U.S. correspondent for the Arab News newspaper. U.S. Arab Radio broadcasts content Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. on WNZK AM 690 in Detroit, WDMV 700 in Washington, D.C., and simulcast through stations around the country. Programs will rerun from 5 till 6 p.m. Visit us on Facebook at U.S. Arab Radio. And we're also streaming live on Facebook.com/Arab News.
We are able to bring on our guest, Annissa Essaibi George. She's an American running in the race for mayor of Boston in the September 14th preliminary election race next week. Ms. George is an American politician who serves as an at-large member of the Boston City Council. Her father is Tunisian and her mother is Polish. Well, I can just imagine the food that you must be enjoying at your house, Annissa. Welcome to the program.
Ray, thank you so much for having me on this morning. And yes, it was an interesting palate in a regular buffet that we had at home growing up.
Yeah, and I'm sorry about the technical issues that happened. I'm not sure what happened, but everything is streaming live now on radio in Washington and in Detroit and live on the Arab News Facebook page. We just have to do a little adjustment with the audio.
I'm the mother of 4 teenage boys who are getting ready to start school tomorrow, so I've learned through the years to roll with the punches.
Now, you know, being in Chicago, this accent that you have is so phenomenal because it reminds Boston and Chicago are like sister cities. I love that Boston accent. That is phenomenal. Now, listen, tell us a little bit about yourself first. Your father's Tunisian, your mother is Polish, both immigrants or they were born here in the country. Give us a little background on your family and yourself.
No, thanks, Ray, for welcoming me this morning and letting me share a little bit about my story and talk about the race in the run for mayor of Boston. Both my parents immigrated to this country. They have 2 very different immigration stories. My mother, as you mentioned, is Polish. My grandparents, her parents, my grandmother at the age of 14 was taken from her home in Poland to work in a labor camp in Germany. My grandfather was in the Polish army, became a prisoner of war. They met in a displaced persons camp in Germany post-World War II, where my mother was born. They immigrated to the United States when my mother was little and, eventually made their home in the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston. My dad is Tunisian, went to work in France as a young man. My mother had gone to school and studied French to be a French teacher, so found herself visiting France, met my father. He followed her here on a 90-day fiancé visa, which, as you can imagine, my mother, bringing him home, it's different than, meeting someone at the coffee shop or going on a regular date. But he, my mother is Polish Catholic. My father, obviously Tunisian and Arab, a Muslim. And with a little bit of negotiating, my parents were eventually married and, lived a wonderful life for almost 40 years. Unfortunately, I lost my father about 10 years ago. But it was me, my brother, my 2 sisters grew up here in the house that my mother grew up in obviously a very diverse upbringing, 2 very different cultures and ethnicities and religions. But for my parents, education and hard work and community were a big part of their lives and something that they shared very rigorously with me, especially the school piece, and just grateful for the opportunities both my parents and their experiences gave me. Now I'm running for mayor of Boston. I've spent the last 6 years as a city councilor, and just grateful for the opportunity to serve my city, and look forward to serving it in a new capacity.
That's an amazing story. Especially to get into politics, what got you to think that, hey, maybe this is my future in politics? It's so contentious, and especially Boston is and I'm sure Boston is just like Chicago. It's rough and tough politics here. I can only imagine what it's like in Boston. What made you want to get into that?
I'd say it's about the same. It's about the same here. When I was in high school here in Boston, I got engaged in student government, became a member of my school's student council, and then we have a citywide Boston Student Advisory Council that does a lot of work, especially around education and student voice and all of that work. So at a young age, actually it was former Ray Flynn, who is, well known as the former ambassador, had this a little bit of a battle around schools' budgets, and became really sort of upset about some of the political stuff that was happening in our city. And at a young age, that municipal government is so important to what's happening in everyday life. And said to my parents, said to my father specifically, someday I'm going to run for mayor of Boston. I'm 15, 16 years old at this point. And my father said, he was very, very direct and said, an Arab girl with an Arab name will win nothing in this city. Consider a life in law, go to business school, do something else. And, he was always my biggest cheerleader, my biggest supporter. He always encouraged me to, strive and set high goals, but he just didn't see a future for me in politics because of the city that he had come to. And his experience was not always an easy one, being an immigrant to the city, being a foreigner, being an Arab, being a Muslim. So I'd always had an interest. So eventually went on to college and started teaching, and I taught for 13 years. My father was over the moon that I chose a career in education. But, politics and municipal government just kept calling my name. And I think, today I think a lot about my father's experience. I think a lot about the words he shared with me as a young kid. And I jokingly say, it's about the work, especially as a former teacher. I'm a small business owner. It's about helping our vulnerable residents. But I also, on occasion, tap into my 15-year-old self. I'm going to prove my father wrong. As a good Arab girl should always strive to do. And I'm just grateful for the opportunity to serve. My understanding is I'm the only Tunisian American elected to office in the country. A number of years ago, I did a exchange program to Tunisia and was excited to meet some other elected Tunisian Americans, and there was none, and it made me sort of sad. And I hope that Arab American women in particular will look at opportunities in politics and in government and elected office.
Yeah, and this is great, I think, for Arab Americans. They should know who you are, and it is interesting to be the first Tunisian to hold public office. You've been a member of the Boston City Council. It said delegate at large, and I'm not sure how that's different from Chicago. We call them aldermen, members of our city council. You actually sit on the city council and have been a member on the city council, and is it at large, meaning you're elected from the entire city or from a ward?
That's exactly it. So we have a 13-member city council. 9 are districts, so the city of Boston is divided up into 9 sections, and then 4 of us are citywide or at large. So I'm elected by the entire city of Boston and have been. I'm in my 3rd term now, and just excited to run for mayor and excited to be a front runner, excited about the feedback and the momentum we have going into the last, I think it's 6 days now, to the preliminary. We have a preliminary here in Boston. It's a nonpartisan race, so the top 2 vote getters will move on to the general election or the final election November 2nd.
And I bet running citywide actually gave you an advantage running in this election, right? If you were just in a ward, who would know you? I mean, they'd read about you and things, but running citywide, that's probably given you a base because according to the latest polls I've seen, you're neck and neck with, I think it's Michelle Wu, who's also a delegate at large, I think, a member of the Boston City Council. And, they're saying that she's leading slightly, but, there's a margin of error there. And I think it's tied. I think you're doing great. You two are the leaders.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Ray. And yes, and this is a very interesting race. We have, 5 sort of primary candidates and, really feel that going into these last couple of days, feel the momentum of being a front runner and having an at-large base, having a citywide presence and being elected citywide all of these times now certainly is helpful when we think about, strength, we think about numbers, we think about name recognition, and certainly the opportunity to grow that becomes a little bit easier when you have a base already laid. And of the 5 candidates, 1 came from the former administration, And the other 4 of us are members of the Boston City Council, 2 at large and 2 district representatives.
Was it hard running as a woman and an Arab American in your first election, the very first time you ran? I'm going to assume that was about 12 years ago, right around then, because you have 4-year terms?
No, 2-year terms. 2-year terms.
Oh, okay, 2-year terms.
The mayor has 4-year terms. The council has 2-year terms, which it's an interesting dynamic when you think about the balance between the city council and the mayor. And we have a strong mayor system here in Boston. So I ran actually 8 years ago. I lost my first race. There were 19 of us on the ballot the first time I ran at large, and finished 5th in the top 4 vote getters win. So although it was a loss, it was a very successful run. And I ran again in 2015, and I beat an 18-year incumbent to earn my seat on the council, and have continued to improve both in numbers and rank in every election since. The work is hard. Campaigning is hard. When I started this effort in 2013, my boys, I have 4 children who are now, my oldest is 16 and I have 15-year-old triplets. So they were, wow, 8 years younger, and, certainly creates an added dynamic to running for office, being the mother of 4 children. My husband and I have worked out a pretty solid system in how we manage all of this. And I've got a great, sort of community around me. My mother, is still with us and local. My in-laws are local. My sisters, are local. And that's really wonderful that they share in this experience with me. And, as much as, especially with my boys, with my kids, I try to limit their exposure, because politics can be difficult. It can get a little chippy, especially in these final days. So, working and educating my boys, especially on what they see on social media, what they're experiencing, what they're hearing, and to try to keep open lines of communication with them.
What was being an Arab? Were you identified as Arab when you first ran? Did that come up, or was that an issue at all? Now Boston has changed considerably, but even 8 years ago when you first ran, lost, then came back 2 years later and won, was it an issue, or is Boston acclimating to the growth of the ethnic identity there? It's 65% are people of color.
Yeah, no, it's definitely been a changing dynamic here in the city of Boston. I'd say the first time I ran in 2013, it was more interesting to be a female in the race, and those dynamics have shifted incredibly. When in 2013, the first time I ran, there was only one woman on the council. It's Congresswoman Presley now, who's now in the Congress. That year added a second woman. When I joined the council in 2015, 2 more of us had joined. The next term, 2 more women had joined. So that the number of women, now we have a majority female council, which was only 8 years ago. We had 1 woman sitting on the Boston City Council. And, the Arab population here in Boston is growing, but it's growing slowly. And we see it in certain parts of our city. We don't have sort of a critical mass here in the city. So being an Arab comes up in some conversations. It's more of like an inquisition, like an education and an introduction to the Arab community, to the Tunisian population and sort of culture and religion. We do have in Boston a very large Lebanese population, and again, in parts of our city, they tend to be, and they've been really great supporters in this race. As an Arab woman, engaging with them has been a lot of fun, and sort of reconnecting with my own roots. I haven't been, I was in Tunisia just a few years ago, and obviously with COVID and the pandemic and all of that, it's limited my ability to get there for a visit. I look forward to returning to Tunisia. My family is there, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, and I tell my children hundreds of cousins, and I look forward to returning. When I went a few years ago, we had initiated conversations around creating a sister city program between Tunis and Boston, and we think about the very similar cities that we have, whether it's, a harbor city, the role of trade, the role of art, the role of just culture and community.
your the background there, I know they're like the woman power, I think, in politics. We've seen a rise in that. Actually 7 candidates, 5 have really done very well, or at least 4. And those 4 out of the 7 that have done well, all 4 have been women, correct? What
female mayor.
And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I mean, what is it? You're talking about a very macho city. And again, I'm talking about when I say Irish in politics, it's redundant. In Chicago, and I'm assuming it's like that in Boston. I love Boston. I've been there so many times. What is it? What do you think has changed that allowed women to really kind of step to the front of the stage and to dominate this election? It's amazing. Every mayor prior to now has been a white male, mostly Irish, I think.
Yep. No, that's accurate. I think that women are coming into their own power here in the city of Boston, and a lot of that, obviously, the 4 of us come from the city council. So it's about building bench strength. It's about and that's the bench. The city council, in many ways, has become the bench for the mayor's office. Although mayors come from our state legislature, our former mayor, now Secretary Walsh, was a state representative prior to becoming mayor of the city. Before him, Mayor Menino actually came from the city council. So there is a little bit of a pipeline that we're able to cultivate, but women are becoming more involved in political life, running for office and winning. And that has been a real shift, especially over the last, 5 years or so, if you look a little bit further back to 10 years, you saw that tide begin to change. And this is about women in public life, women sort of taking the lead, which is so important for women to do, but also high quality women candidates. That's also really important. You want a woman in office because that's important. Representation matters, but you want the right woman in office. You want the woman who has the skill set and the experiences to lead. And I believe that's me. And I think the voters of Boston, the residents of Boston see that as well. And that's why I've done so well in the polls.
What do you think is going to be the most deciding issue, the most important issue in this election? What is it that voters are asking you to address?
Yeah, so there's a few things that we're talking the most about here in Boston and in this race. Housing and the cost of housing, the cost of living here in the city of Boston has grown tremendously, and Boston has become too expensive for too many. So housing is a critical issue. We talk a lot about education in our school system. Boston Public Schools, the oldest public school system in the nation, is and continues to have still too many struggles when we think about our kids. And for me, as a former educator, a former classroom teacher of 13 years, that has been a priority of mine to improve the quality of education across the board for all of our kids. Certainly the pandemic has been an issue when we think about COVID, our work to recover from this issue, this public health crisis, this healthcare issue. But we also have a significant challenge around the opioid crisis and homelessness and mental illness here in the city of Boston. We have a growing population of our city's residents who are unsheltered and also dealing with substance use disorder. So that's also significant. And, when I think about the job and the role of being mayor, the tasks of being mayor, the responsibility of leading the city, it's around the public health crisis, it's around public safety, it's around climate action, and it's also about basic city services. I hear that across our city in so many of our neighborhoods that, filling potholes and building playgrounds and making sure the trash is picked up. Basic sort of everyday city services are critical to every city's residents' quality of life. And we've got a lot of work to do to make sure that we're responsible to the needs of our city's residents, from sort of the bigger issues to those smaller, not less important, but sometimes not seen as critical to the operation, the function, and the experience of the city.
I'm going to guess your husband is Lebanese. George is a very popular Lebanese name, or am I wrong?
Yeah, you're actually wrong. I'm sorry to say that. He is American, several generations too. The George is just...
That's not his fault.
Part Albanian in there.
That's interesting. Okay, Albanian. What a mix. I mean, that has to be phenomenal. The background you have, the candidates running in office. I know that we pretty much cut into all the time we were going to have with you, but what is your website if people want to support you to get more information? Where should they go if they want to look you up?
No, Ray, I appreciate that. And anyone that wants to engage with the campaign or take a better look or a deeper look at both my bio, my story, my history, but also my policy pages, because we've got a lot of work to do. And I'm a big believer in partnership, and all of our policy docs are dynamic documents. So give them a look and share some feedback. You can go to my website, which is AnnissaForBoston.com, ANNISSAFOR Boston.com. I spell it with 2 N's. It's a little bit of a trick my dad played on my mother. They didn't know whether they'd have an Arab name or an American name. And so they made up a name that is actually an Arab name. So that's how I ended up with the 2 N's. Just, Ray, thank you so much for including me this morning and welcoming me on.
Listen, it was great, and I apologize for the technical issues, but it was so nice that we're able to do this. We wish you the best. The election is next week, 1 week from today on September 14th, correct? And then
Tuesday, it's last 6 days, Tuesday the 14th. And then I'm hopeful to go on to the general, and I look forward to talking to you again between September 14th and November 2nd.
That'll be great, and we won't have technical issues. My guest, Annissa Essaibi George. The website is AnnissaForBoston.com. Is that correct? Okay, the .com. I want to get that right. Annissa is ANNISSA for Boston. Annissa, thank you for joining us again. It was a pleasure meeting you. Good luck next week. We want to see what happens. Thank you. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking with Abed Ayoub at ADC. We'll be right back right after these messages.
Bringing you breaking news from across the Middle East and the latest on Arabs in America. Get inside the latest headlines with expert analysis and insights at ArabNews.com. Join over 5 million Facebook fans and over 10 million monthly readers. ArabNews.com. News that matters.
I hear you good. So we're going to do a quick sound check to see if we had a little technical issue. Oh, good.
Locations in Bloomfield Hills and 5
we were having some issues in Ohio.
IVF has experts in
first interview with the audio.
As a founding
everything
member
is
of
perfect
IVF
now.
Michigan Fertility Centers, Dr. Nicholas Shama is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. Dr. Shama has performed over 10,000 IVF cases and has helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. American Board Certified in both obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility, Dr. Nicholas Shama is a very caring, compassionate, expert physician that understands not only the medical but also the emotional toil of infertility on his patients. When it's time, get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio. Call toll-free 855-952-9600, 855-952-9600.
While we've been staying safe at home, scientists have been on a journey. The destination, a COVID-19 vaccine. This journey began decades ago with research into other coronaviruses. Scientists built from there with months of research and development, cooperation with other experts worldwide, and clinical trials on tens of thousands of volunteers of diverse race, age, and health status. They arrived at a safe, effective vaccine, and hundreds of thousands in Michigan have already been vaccinated. But the next step is ours. We need to get the vaccine when we can. Keep wearing masks correctly and taking precautions until we reach our destination, freedom from COVID-19 and getting back to the lives we love. Discover the facts for yourself at michigan.gov/COVID vaccine. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
And welcome back.
The U.S. Arab Radio Network is proud to offer the Ray Hanania Show with veteran journalist Ray Hanania, the U.S. correspondent for the Arab News newspaper. U.S. Arab Radio broadcasts content Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. on WNZK AM 690 in Detroit, WDMV 700 in Washington, D.C., and simulcast through stations around the country. Programs will rerun from 5 till 6 p.m. Visit us on Facebook at U.S. Arab Radio. And we're also streaming live on Facebook.com/Arab News.
And welcome back to the Ray Hanania Show here at WNZK AM 690 Radio in Detroit, where we're broadcasting live, and at WDMV AM 700 Radio in Washington, D.C., where we're broadcasting live. And we're also streaming live on Facebook.com/Arab News. So many things I wanted to tell you about before our interview with Annissa Essaibi George. One of them is the Arab News newspaper has a special section coming out on a look back on the 20th anniversary, the commemoration of September 11th. And that's going to be the topic of this segment. With me is Abed Ayoub, the legal director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Abed, thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Ray. Always great to be with you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you guys. I mean, ADC is just a phenomenal organization. You guys do so much. Given all the things that happen to Arab Americans, I don't know how you even have time to do a radio show with me.
We'll always make time for you. So thank you.
I know you do. Listen, obviously, a lot of Americans this week are thinking back on the terrible tragedy of September 11th, the terrorist attacks. They were horrendous. I just remember how my life changed. The job I was at changed. The way people looked at me. I had people come up to me and say, hey, why did my people do that? And I'm thinking, what? People from the south side of Chicago did something? We were always discriminated against as Arabs in this country. But after September 11th, it took a kind of like a bifurcated, sharp turn. On the one hand, it was real bad. On the other hand, people with some sensibilities started to look at us a little more serious and fairly. So we got advantages and disadvantages. But one of the issues that always bothered me after September 11th and in the weeks and months that followed were these killings that took place. They called them backlash killings. Yeah. Not all of them were even Arab. Right. A lot of them were Muslim. All you had to do was look Middle Eastern. A lot of them were Sikh, Indian or Pakistani, and Americans that were so angered they went out and they murdered people. Tell us a little bit about this. I know ADC did a report on this. I've written a number of stories about it. Give us an overview of how serious was it? Was it just a fluke, a few people, or was it serious enough? And, do Americans even recognize these victims?
So thank you, Ray, and thank you for covering that point. And look, the aftermath and the backlash after 9/11 was serious. And anytime you have a loss of life due to violence, whether it be through, the senseless terror attacks that occurred, that day, it's always serious. And the aftermath and the backlash from the community is something against the community is something that should be taken seriously as well. And as you mentioned, there were a number of, backlash murders. The first victim of a hate crime after 9/11 was actually a Sikh American, Balbar Sodi, who was shot while in Arizona while working at a gas station. So it's out in Mesa, Arizona. These types of incidents played themselves out shortly after 9/11 in the years following after 9/11. And I think our report cited nearly a dozen murders or so that took place, a dozen or so murders that took place, in the immediate aftermath, all the way from Mesa, Arizona, out in Michigan, Minneapolis, we had one in Los Angeles. So it's definitely something that's serious. I don't know how much, of this information many Americans are aware of. I don't know if they understand that this happened or even aware that this happened, but it did happen. And this is not even, these cases, this is not even talking about the employment discrimination cases and the other general discrimination or verbal abuse that we continue to see. These are, the serious violent hate crimes.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the killings, this backlash, which I think should be taken more seriously than other things. It kind of blended in with the wave of discrimination. Another would say, oh, yeah, they discriminated against Arabs and killed some. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, there 2,996 people died at the Twin Towers, at the Pentagon, and in a field in Pennsylvania because of the terrorists. But another 24 died in the weeks and months after because of what happened. They should be given the same, I think, treatment. They should be recognized during these commemorations. I think it's disrespectful as an American that nobody is taking it as, other than obviously ADC and a number of groups, but mainstream American society isn't taking it serious enough to say, wow, there were 24 people that were murdered as a result of September 11th. They're victims of September 11th. I mean, maybe they should get compensation, their families, the way the victims of the September 11th terrorism were supported. But we've never even got to the point where we were even really officially acknowledged as connected to that. We're just part of a wave of discrimination.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there needs to be more recognition to these victims. There also needs to be an understanding that it hasn't stopped. The hate crimes continue. The violent hate crimes have continued, and this is born out of the September 11th attack. It's directly an aftermath and an effect of that. So even though we're 20 years, after the 9/11 attacks, we are still seeing the fallout against the community, and on many fronts, on the violent hate crimes attacks, and on the more passive discrimination we see in the workplace and in other areas of our life. So it's definitely out there.
I know that 4 of the cases were clearly, at least the official reports were that, yes, they're victims of backlash. They were specifically targeted because of who they were. The other maybe 18 incidents and tragedies of killings were kind of disputed, but I think it was in part because the police, they never thought to say how significant is it that like Ali El-Mansoub, who was in Detroit, he was with his girlfriend. Her old boyfriend came in, was angry, shot him, and said at the time, you deserve it because you're one of those people that attacked us on September 11th. The police didn't give weight to that. I don't know if September 11th may not have happened. Would Ali El-Mansoub still be alive? And I think he would be.
He would be. And look, you touched on one important point, and that's, law enforcement was not equipped after 9/11 to address hate crimes and to address our concerns. There wasn't a category for an anti-Arab hate crime on the DOJ form until about 2011 or 12, after ADC intervened and we petitioned for inclusion on that box. And hate crime laws are generally hate crime reporting is generally hard to enforce. Many municipalities won't bring hate crimes charges or won't even investigate hate crime charges. So it's definitely a flaw in the law enforcement and in the way these charges are brought. And it's an issue we've picked up on over the past 20 years, and something that is to be taken seriously. But you're absolutely right. Law enforcement was not in any way equipped. They didn't have the understanding of the community. They didn't have the knowledge of, I think, even hate crime laws within their own districts or jurisdictions. And that's why we see such little action that was brought against some of these perpetrators.
And I'm a big supporter of the police. I mean, everybody in Chicago knows that I'm a big supporter of the police. Yes, there are some bad apples. It's a small percentage. We don't stereotype police because of the actions of one person, the way sometimes it's being done. But I have to say that there are instances where members of the police are like the rest of America, and their anger overcomes their logic, and they look at us and they say, it's your fault. What did you and I have to do with September 11th? We had nothing to do with it, right? I served during the Vietnam War. You're an American citizen. You pay your taxes. You live law-abiding lives. We support everything American. And yet every time something happens in the Middle East, and I don't know if it's like this in any other ethnic group, an Arab or a Muslim does something someplace else, and you and I are immediately front and center. The media calls me up and they say, hey, Ray, What did you think of the terrorist attack today? What did they expect me to say? Oh, yeah, go, or, of course I'm upset. I'm an American. We're both American.
Right.
How do we overcome that? And how serious is that still a problem today, 20 years later?
It's still a serious problem. There was a report just published the other day. I'm not sure who put it out, and I'll email it to you, where it shows that more people today, 20 years after 9/11, view Islam and Arabs as a threat than immediately after 9/11. So this PR machine, this campaign against us over the past 20 years has been somewhat successful on their front. They've found a way to turn some of the part of the population against us. But what we have to do is continue pushing back through our work. We have to control the narrative. We have to be front and center when it comes to media, when it comes to our own reporting, when it comes to putting our image out there. We have to respond in different ways, and we have to be involved, I think, on all levels of governance, not just running for Congress in DC or state legislature, but also being involved in your city council races, mayoral races, even your neighborhood, association. So we have to be involved on all levels and put ourselves out there. And I think that's one thing we've done right over the past 20 years is this civic engagement. It's getting involved with all assets of, with all parts of government, working with law enforcement to help them understand who we are, educating them on hate crime laws and on different issues as well. So we've really grown the past 20 years. We still have a long way to go, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Living in Chicago as I do, the Chicagoland region, race and ethnicity are the building blocks of politics. And I wonder, has the problem been that despite everything and the talent we have in the Arab American community and the Muslim community, still we don't seem, and I'm not sure as we're not effectively telling our story, or we're effectively telling our story, but it's being blocked by our society. Where do you think the problem is? Are we doing enough to tell my neighbor who has so many problems? He has to pay a mortgage. He has 2 cars. His kids are going to college. And now he needs to understand what my problems are. Am I doing enough to educate him so when there is a terrorist attack, he doesn't yell and scream at me and say, why did I do it, or why did my people do it the way they did after September 11th?
I think we've done enough of that. I think if people want information on Arabs and on Muslims and even on South Asian communities, it's out there. I mean, if they want to educate themselves, it's out there. I think the one thing we as a community need to understand, after 20 years after 9/11 is this, and I learned this through the past year or so during the pandemic, while we would do our virtual town halls with our chapters across the country, the one thing I often heard was, hey, how do you want me to worry about, Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiment when I can't even put food on my kids' table to eat at dinner time? The issues impacting regular Americans are impacting us, and we need to be involved in those conversations. When it comes to healthcare, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to responsible policing, business advancements and opportunities, we need to be involved in those conversations. We've done a good job of being involved on everything else, the national security, the airport issues. Now it's time over the next 20 years to pull ourselves into the direction this country is going as a whole. We are part of this country. And, what happens with this pending infrastructure bill impacts me and my daughter for decades to come. What happens with policing in Chicago and the direction the mayor decides to take is going to impact you and, generations to come. So we need to be involved in those conversations a lot more. And that's, I think, the direction we're looking to go, over the next 20 years, not only at ADC, but as a community as well.
And I don't think it's enough for government. And again, I think I have a right to demand that government do more because I'm a taxpayer. I served during the military. I'm as American as everybody else. I don't care what they say about whether they like Arabs or Muslims. And half of the Americans, probably the majority of the Americans, don't even realize I'm Christian. They always come up and say you're Muslim. And I'm proud to be confused as a Muslim. As a Christian Arab, I'm basically Muslim by culture. And I'm so proud of that I'm in that odd situation, pushed in it by the lack of knowledge that, a woman came up to me right after September 11th and said, I can't believe you abandoned your Christian faith to become an Arab. And I looked at her and I said, this is why I'm getting into stand-up comedy. There's no answer to that type of sad, naive, I don't want to say ignorant, like to be mean to her, but it was an ignorant thing to say. And I don't think she realized it. She thought she was just making a nice observation.
Right. No, you're right. And now that problem is even worse with social media and misinformation campaigns. So, if for every, ounce of energy we put in, there's a whole complete system and algorithm against us. So it's definitely more challenging now to get our message out there, I think, on all fronts, on the health front, on the economic front. I think we've seen this play out over the past 4 or 5 years, but fake news and misinformation, I mean, that's a great challenge for us, and that's going to do us some damage, I think, and some harm towards the community.
Yeah, I hate, because I've been in journalism for so many years, I hate the idea of any kind of censorship. I'd rather see the ugliness so it can be identified than have the ugliness pushed aside and pretend it's not there. Because when we pretend something's not there, as you know, with ADC, that we can't fight the anti-Arab hatred or the Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hatred if we don't see it. And if it's pushed out of sight, sometimes how do we know it's happening? How are things today, 20 years after September 11th? Far better, okay, still far to go. Where would you rate it, the situation for Arabs and Muslims in this country?
Look, I think it's definitely far better in that, we've organized ourselves as a community. I think there's a better understanding of who we are as a community. I think the backlash, when you really break down the hatred towards the community, we can pinpoint where it's coming from. We understand the misinformation campaigns. We understand the machine and the money that's behind it now. And that you're right, that makes it easier to attack. But we have to organize and counter that. And I think we've pulled ourselves into conversations on, again, almost every level of governance across the country. You have people, Arabs and Muslims and Arab Christians as well involved in running for races on traditional platforms, whether they be Republican or Democrat or independent. They're running on platforms that have nothing to do with their race or ethnicity. They just happen to be an Arab running for this position.
Right.
But their qualifications are, far more than just being an Arab. And I think that's important. We are seeing more of that, but there is still a little bit more work for us to do.
And don't we have to see ourselves in the mirror of American life? I mean, when I turn on the TV, I rarely see Arab. Now, I notice that there's more emphasis to understand Muslims. And again, I'm not being critical of Muslims, but they have benefited, I think, from the post-September 11th world. People tend to talk about us as Muslim rather than Arab. And I'm not saying that that's a problem, but the fact that the Arab identity is being pushed down a little bit because of that, and not because of Muslims, but because of the way Americans look at it. It's kind of a touchy topic because, in our community, if you start talking Christian and Muslims, they say, hey, we're all the same. Why do we got to talk about them? But we're not all the same to Americans. We're all the same to us.
Yeah, we're not all the same too. I mean, we are the Americans look at us as the same, whether you're Arab, Muslim, Christian, Pakistani, whether you're, Afghan, they look at us as all the same. And even the perpetrator of a hate crime looks at us as the same. There is a differentiation, of course, between Arab and Muslims and how that gets portrayed in the media and the factors behind that. I think that's a longer conversation we can have. But the one thing I would say is there has been a coming back to the Arab culture and identity within the community. There's been a lot more pride and understanding in who we are because of 9/11 and particularly because of the Arab Spring and what happened, afterwards. There's been more of a coming back to the Arab identity and the Arab culture, and I think that's something we'll continue seeing. Look, you can be a proud Arab and a proud Muslim, a proud Arab and a proud Christian. I mean, you can be all. That's the beauty of being Arab is we are diverse. We have a rich background, religiously, culturally, and that's going to continue. And I think we're seeing a lot more people coming back to the to the culture and to the identity and pushing it forward over the next few years.
Do you think our internal fighting in our community goes a little too far, or is that not an issue anymore?
There's always going to be internal fighting. Sometimes it does go too far.
We're an emotional people. We're an emotional
people. But look, I think in this country as a whole now, you have the woke culture and you have the cancel culture on both sides that will, looking to bring people down for a mistake they may have made 10, 15 years ago, regardless of how remorseful or how much they apologize. And I think that's a that's just an era, where we are in this country, and we're going to have to navigate it. And I don't think we're immune to that. I think we see that in the community. Sometimes it's right. Sometimes it's, most of the time it's wrong. I'm a true believer in the, doctrine of redemption. I think people should have an opportunity to redeem themselves before their careers are over or before they're, canceled off the scene. But this is just where we are. And we have to navigate it. And I think we'll get through this and mature through this phase.
And the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee is one of the leading, if not the leading organization fighting for the rights of Arabs and Muslims, addressing discrimination. You're a non-political organization. You're there to kind of deal with issues that not just impact Arabs and Muslims, but Americans because it impacts them. When someone discriminates against somebody, it has an impact on their lives. What does it look? What's the terrain like in the U.S.? Is there a place that's more, I don't want to say dangerous, but has more anti-Arab or anti-Muslim issues than others? Is there a place in the U.S. where, wow, these people love us so much, there isn't one person that dislikes an Arab? What's the terrain like in terms of where we're welcome and where we're not welcome?
Look, I think it's important to separate between, government actions and the people on the ground. I think with social media, with everything being in our face all the time on Twitter, and you're reading, you kind of get the perception that we're hated or that problems are, exacerbated, where you see one incident and you think this is happening all over, for example, the state of Florida, where it's actually not true. A lot of these incidents are isolated. The person may be somebody that has a history of doing this. But we are, pretty much liked across the country. Now, my concern is if this misinformation campaign, if these campaigns on social media keep going further and further, we're going to start seeing a lot more people radicalized and a lot more people, becoming perpetrators of hate crimes. And that could happen anywhere. It's not isolated to a single state.
Do you think the media plays a major role or a minor role in fueling the problems that we face as an ethnic and religious and national group?
Well, I think, to answer that question, I think we have to look at how, the definition of media has changed over the past 20 years.
That's true.
I think now you have, a lot of these far right-wing news outlets that, are responsible for what's happening. And and I'm not saying that the left-wing media or the left-leaning media is not, they're responsible as well. They have their issues. And I think the one commonality between four administrations over the past 20 years is the war on terror and the way they treat Arabs. Not one of them has changed. From Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, they've all treated us the same. Not one of them got rid of sections of the Patriot Act or surveillance or changed their tone or didn't talk about us through a national security lens. So it's still, happening even with a Democrat in office. But the change in media, the change in media outlets, social media, this is something we as a community need to take, keep an eye on, be involved in, and try to use those same tools to our advantage.
And I know I had mentioned to you in an email that in Chicago, we're seeing this disturbing trend of the city has put together a task force of police and inspectors because they think by targeting not just Arab-owned, but ethnic-owned grocery stores in the heart of where the violence is, they're going to somehow discourage the street gang members from coming out and shooting people. And I'm sure it's a national story, even in Washington, D.C., that Chicago's violence has skyrocketed. Over Labor Day weekend, 61 people were shot and 6 people were killed, including a little boy who was sitting in his house getting his hair braided when a bullet came right through the window and killed him in front of the friend. It was just amazing. These are troubling trends that have to be examined. But are there other issues like that around the country that we should be aware of, that we should pay attention to?
Well, look, it's we had 63 shootings over the weekend in D.C., so there's definitely something.
Wow. And why is it that they treat Chicago worse than not to say that I want to
it's horrible, and there's definitely something that needs to happen in a real grown-up conversation between everybody that cares about this issue. And I was reading the email you sent this morning about the what's happening with the business owners, and this is where it's going to take some creative solutions to bring the business owners down and sit down with the mayor's office and say, hey, here's what we can do. We had a similar situation in Detroit years ago and they implemented a great program, which I can email you about. Maybe that's something that can be done, but there has to be these conversations. And look, and it's funny you brought this up now, but the discrimination against Arab business owners, that's one thing we also saw after 9/11. Right. And this is a quiet discrimination, where it's very passive, where they come in, they check a few things, and they say, well, we're going to shut you down for a week. We're going to shut you down for 2 weeks for something very minor.
Right. And
there's ways to resolve that. You don't need to shut down the business, but the business owner needs to understand, hey, I need to take some measures. If there's, a crime spree happening in front of my shop or my gas station, maybe I need to put up brighter lights. Maybe I need to put up HD cameras to, see what's happening.
In other words, that person can help, but
that person can help, but you don't help them by shutting
them
down.
Of being the problem.
Yeah, they're not the problem.
Right.
You can. They're a problem when there's blight, when there's, and we can get, it's a longer conversation. But but if they're take care of their business and work with the city, I don't think you shut them down. No.
Abed, listen, thank you so much for joining us. What's the website at ADC again for our listeners who want to visit and get more information?
Very easy. It's adc.org.
Perfect. Abed
thank you.
Ayoub, our legal advisor at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee. Abed, it's always a pleasure to have you on the radio show. We appreciate your support. And I want to thank everybody that's watching. Again, we appreciate that. And we will see you next week here at WNZK AM 690 in Detroit and WDMV AM 700 in Washington, D.C. and streaming live at facebook.com/Arab News. I'm Ray Hanania. Have a great week, everybody. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ray.
WNZK has available a few good